Thank you all, members of the media, for being here. It is my pleasure as Senior Minister here at First Unitarian to welcome you all. This issue of how we allocate our resources is something that First Unitarian Church and the religious community in general have been speaking out for and against for many years. So this is a continuation for us of a conversation. We're in the budget cycle in Washington, of course, also down in Salem and soon here in Portland itself. It's a process that is often described as making sausage, and sadly, it often feels that way. But the folks who will be speaking to you this morning are not in the sausage-making business. We're in the business of trying to help our folks and others understand what they can rely on, what abides, what values should guide our lives, in what can we trust. Any reasonable look at the United States budget, not just Obama's budget, but our budget over many years, tells you that the United States is placing its reliance on military power. We spend more on our military than all of the rest of the developed world combined. It's a moral statement, a statement of what we value and what we trust. And it says that we place our trust in military force and not anything else. As we go through the process and observe it and try to have an impact on it as our budget is created, there are some fundamental questions that I think we need to ask ourselves and to ask our leaders. Are we only willing to rely on military force for our safety and security? Are we not willing to rely at all on our ideals and the promise of this democracy? The images from Egypt have been powerful in the last weeks. There, a people rose up and changed a regime. We hope and pray that that change continues in a nonviolent and positive direction. That's still uncertain. But contrast that with the images from Iraq, where the United States went in with the avowed objective of regime change and effected it at huge cost, not only in dollars, but in human lives of Americans and Iraqis. On what should we rely? Should we not trust in the good intentions of people and their desire to control their own lives, rather than trusting on our ability to impose a solution on them? The current budget conversation will involve many, many specifics. There will be arguments about specific programs that are cut and those that are supported. It seems to me that all of those are good conversations because the needs of the American people are great in this time. But I hope we can be informed by that larger conversation about what the core values of this society in which we live and in which we participate should be, on the reliance we can place on the ultimate importance of love in our lives. Thank you very much.
Reverend Siegfried just spoke quite eloquently about the way that de facto America seems to be imposing its will on the rest of the world. If you look just back historically over the last period, it seems to be the case. And yet when it comes to budget making, I think that the leaders in Washington, Democrat and Republican, are all relying upon not the active imposition of American will so much as the passivity of the citizenry of America when it comes to crunching numbers. It's because of this passivity that religious leaders have to speak up. And what we just saw taking place in Tahrir Square in Cairo should give us cheer, but it should also be very dismaying, in that if we listen to leaders in this wonderful country, what we heard were equivocal statements over the weeks. and days and hours. Equivocal statements which spoke in terms of stability. Equivocal statements which balanced the wishes, the heartfelt desires of common people in another country to have a future against the worrying fear of the unknown. Tomorrow comes, and yet it seems that our budgeting process has nothing so much to do with tomorrow as much as it does with yesterday. So our religious traditions teach us to read texts, and if we look in the biblical text, certainly we see that for many, many years, over a long period of time, centuries ago, there were prophets who railed against those in power and said, you make alliances, you trust in horses, in armaments, you arm yourselves to the teeth, and you buttress your power. You put money in the pockets of power elites, and yet you don't trust in the true source of faith. How could we not have experienced the joy over the past couple of weeks when a people stated loudly and clearly that it wanted to be free and democratic, especially in this country? And how is it that we continue to spend the enormous sums of money on the military when we remove Pell Grants from needy students here and we question the possibility of heating homes for needy senior citizens, or we remove block grants in cities like our own here in Portland? How can we cut the budget? How can we stand by idly if we don't look at these sorrowful statements about who we are? How can we continue to ignore, in fact, as the richest nation in the world, millennial development goals that we committed to not so very long ago, once again in the name of buttressing the military and projecting our supposed good name all around the world? We stand here as religious people. We're called by our faith to affirm the will of communities here and everywhere around the world who want to be free, individuals who want to face tomorrow jubilantly. How can we be silent at this time when people play with numbers and make gentlemen's agreements? Thank you.
In the faith communities, we've been standing together for peace for many years. Muslim, Jew, Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, and many people of goodwill. It does not always make the news, because when you speak of love and new possibilities, it's not as glitzy as battles or weaponry. The other thing I want to say, too, is in faith communities on this corner and in every corner in this city and across this nation, we deal with the ravages of war. While some who romanticize it or say that's the way to go off to comfortable homes at night, we have those who have been devastated by warfare coming to our houses of worship daily, seeking some kind of support in a society that is forgotten. Many years ago, a great poet, faith leader, said these words: "No man, or I'd say woman today, is an island entire of itself. Every person is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." Goes on to say, "And therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." Since September 11th, 2001, when 400 people gathered in our sanctuary and bells tolled, they have been tolling ever since. They not only tolled for the 3,000 that died that night, but in the midst of prayer that night and candlelight, they tolled for peace, because we knew the winds of war in this nation were howling even that night as we grieved those who had died. That speaks more to a culture we live in than anything else, that we are so poised and ready to seek out vengeance rather than reconciliation and new ways of living. Over the past decade, bells have tolled and other instruments and other places of worship throughout this land for the unnumbered thousands of Afghani children, women, and men who have died in war. They have tolled for the unnumbered thousands of Iraqi children, women, and men who have died in war. Endless war, it appears. Our peace bells at Augustin has tolled for the thousands of women and men in this country who have died in combat as well. It has tolled for those who have taken their own lives upon return. It has tolled for the many individuals in all countries that have been maimed or damaged by the wounds of war, both physical that we can see and psychological that we cannot see, often until it's too late. Again, for generations, synagogues, mosques, temples, churches have worked with others of goodwill for peace. And again, it seldom gets lifted up on the front pages. Sound bites for violence play better than stories of hope and reconciliation. Today, we as people of faith call upon the leaders of this land, from our president to the Congress, to challenge that military-industrial complex that is ever alive in this land. We produce more weaponry than any nation on the face of the earth. The only industry that really boomed during a recession, depression, was the arms industry in this land, which exported $81 billion worth of weapons. Our runner-up was $3.5 billion in another country. It is time to remind our leaders what every child learns in their civic classes. There are only three branches of government: the executive, the judicial, legislative. There's not a fourth arm of government called the arms industry. There are only three, and they exist to serve the people for the common good. As we look at the budgets that are being proposed, both by our presidents, which will probably be the most progressive one that comes forward, that's scary in this day when you look at the numbers and you think, what will come next, from others in Congress. We call and point out again that almost 60% of the discretionary budget will go for war. The Department of Defense, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Veterans Affairs, nuclear weapons, the Department of Energy, and deep cuts will be made in vital programs: grants to college students, community block grants, home heating oil assistance for low-income persons, and the list goes on. Our spending outnumbers, as others have said, all the countries in the world combined. Today we are calling upon the President and Congress to change the direction we are heading, to measure our nation as generations before us, people of faith and goodwill, have measured it not by military might, but about how the most vulnerable in our midst are doing, not just in this land, but in this global village. How are the poor and the vulnerable, the child and the elder, the forgotten and the dispossessed? Only then can we claim to be a leader in the world. In the Christian community this past month, we've been focusing on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And you know one of those key lines: blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. We call upon all people of goodwill and faith to rise up on March 19th, to give leaders in this nation courage to address those industries and winds that are entrenched in this nation. We call as people of faith for a new day of morality over militarism, human integrity over arms industries, will for peace over winds of war. Violence only begets violence. Love overcomes. Pie in the sky, some may say. Oh, wishful thinking. We know a God of many names who makes a way out of no way. We know a God of many names who brings peace and reconciliation out of brokenness and violence. We know a God of many names for whom nothing is impossible. And so, people of faith and this goodwill, might we stand up and encourage our leaders. Quote to them from Isaiah the prophet, who said, God will judge between the nations and cause us to turn our swords into plowshares, our spears into pruning hooks, that we might study war no more. Quote to our leaders on all sides of the aisle to study Isaiah 58 as they move forward, which says, if you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, Then your light shall rise like the noonday, and the Lord will guide you continuously and satisfy your needs in parched places, and make your bones strong, and you will be like a watered garden, whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets to live in. Thank you.
As pastor of Ainsworth United Church of Christ, I remember the day that we took a unanimous stand against a preemptive strike into Iraq and said no to war. And then I remember going through years of protests and then celebrating somewhat that it looked like the end of the war in Iraq, but with a lot of dismay seeing the buildup of the war in Afghanistan. We celebrated the hope for change, and we celebrated the coming of healthcare reform and with a lot of inspiration and thinking things would be different. But now I have to say I need to talk about family values. Something that some folk in Congress on the right will talk about family values, but they're not my family values. I hear family values spoken about from the right, from the left, from the president, from everywhere. But I don't see them lifted up in the budget for this year. I don't see them reflected. And for me, family values means taking care of families. It means taking care of community, lifting people up, not tearing people apart. It means that the services that we need to supply, to give to people, to share with people, the resources that we have such an abundance of, need to be shared with those most needy. Need to be shared with those most vulnerable. That's my family values. Families need to be built up, not torn down. Healthcare for all is a family value. Education, quality education for all is a family value. Housing for all, believe it or not, is a family value. Head Start, higher education support for those most in need, support for human services to keep families together, and then when families are so abusive and violent, to get the children out of those families and into healthy, nurturing, loving homes. Those are my family values. And I also want to lift up issues around the environment and earth and the care of our earth. And I know those are family values too, but not at the risk of tearing apart families. We need green jobs, but we need jobs. We need employment. We need housing. We need heat for our elderly and for those that are low income. We need medicines for those who are in need and health care. We don't need to bail out those whose expense accounts are far greater than my income. It means that we support jobs to stay in this country, and we help those who are seeking jobs. We don't continue the buildup of the military spending. We don't continue the buildup of prison system spending. We don't continue the buildup and the profits of arms making, weaponry, and nuclear arms. Those are not part of my family values, and I doubt they're yours either. Our nation is protected. Our security is protected when we provide for our people, when justice reigns and not profits. When we stop making war and we start making peace, that's when we will see more security and protection in our country. And, as I am wont to do, you don't need to take my word alone. I always call upon one of my favorite prophets, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said America must re-examine old presuppositions and release itself from many things that for centuries have been held sacred. For the evils of racism, poverty, and militarism to die, a new set of values must be born. Our economy must become more person-centered than property-centered. Our government must depend more on its moral power than on its military power. Amen. Do we have the moral power to become people-centered? Do we really find the value of family and people as our center? Do we have the moral power to support that? To lift it up in the budget, in the way we do business, in the way we spend our income tax, our money, helping the least of these, providing for those in need. It sounds biblical. How funny. We must find the inner strength to recover those values and be about building up lives, not tearing down. We must find ways, even in these hard economic times, because we know the wealth is here, we know the resources are here, we know it is possible. We must find the will, and then we will find the way.
That's a great question, because in point of fact, we have become addicted to the spending on the military in this country. It goes back at least as far as World War II. You remember it was Dwight Eisenhower who talked about the military-industrial complex. Now, we know something about how to deal with addictions. We know that you have to have the will to change, and then you have to have a plan to eliminate that addiction from your life. It's no different at the national level. Will ultimately a shift in our priorities away from military spending as the most important stimulus package we ever pass? Will that create changes and disruptions? There's no doubt. But if it's done in an intentional, staged, and deliberate way, our economy, which is remarkably flexible, will adjust. I think the fear which is put forward that we would suddenly stop all military spending and that in each of the congressional districts where the military spending helps support jobs, that there would suddenly be a huge dislocation, is a naive assumption about what we would do even if we had complete power. I think we need to treat this as an addiction and understand that we need a plan which will gradually shift the balance of how we do our life together.
You know, in our society, I think we've always felt that there's the opportunity to do something great as human beings. In our faith community, certainly. And I think we've been losing that capacity. That fear of changing something like that, which is an addiction, it can get people to be silent or not act. If the same would have been the case, which was the case for many years with slavery in this land, much of the economy was based on, that change would not have come. Women's suffrage, and go right down through the list of civil rights, had not the people of that generation spoken out, or at least of friends that could lead people to a new place, change never would have come. That's the role the faith community has often played in the past, and we've always felt incumbent we have to play it in each generation. We're not living just for this generation to make a profit for ourselves. We have 7, 8, 9, 10 generations to look towards. And sometimes you begin a great thing, as some theologians have said, in your lifetime. You may not see the end results, but you begin it right now and trust that as the will changes, the perspective and the priorities change. And that's what we're always about. How do we change the will in this country that is addicted to a military-industrial complex to something new?
I also would venture to say that that money that is being spent on military can be used and focused then back in the communities where military budgets were necessary to keep things going, providing training and jobs for people to develop our infrastructure again, build the bridges that are falling apart, build, pave the highways, build the schools, so on and so forth. We can recycle that money into positive ends to help those communities, and relieve the addiction, which I really appreciate that term, to military buildup.
Well, I want to say something else about addiction. I think that before you treat addiction, you have to grapple with the fact that you're living with illusion, and you have to discover how vulnerable you are. And I think that that's a direction that this country is moving in. And yet, I don't think, unfortunately, I'd like to say that I have the faith that right now this is going to happen. I think it's going to take many, many leaders and many educators, many thinkers. Reverend Smith Lopez quoted Martin Luther King correctly, a beautiful, beautiful quote. And yet, Dr. King spoke of a reliance on a whole different creed and underpinning to society to bring about a just future for the human beings who live here and who live around the world. I think that as long as we're addicted to the kind of rich versus poor, the illusion of protecting ourselves at the expense of others outside and inside our communities, we've got work to do. And that's the horror of addiction. We need people to speak out. We need people to teach. We need people, we need the poets. We need the people to awaken many, many more, especially in the next generation, to understand what they could do for themselves and to make change here, to build the roads, the bridges, to lift up the valleys and to lower the high peaks so as to create a metaphor, a beautiful metaphor for justice, one that they can really believe in, one they can picture, envision, and make happen soon.
This is a president that I admire in many ways. Went to his inauguration. And he is not able to put forward a budget that would dismantle or begin to turn the tide. That speaks to the will of the people of this nation. We all have to look in the mirror and ask, what are our values today? Are they family values like we heard spoken of? Are they values of faith? Because one person can never do it. It's up to humanity to speak out. Again, Egypt's a prime example of that change that happened in 18 days. And here we are 8 years into warfare. So even with some of the best leadership, you can't get there unless we as the people in this country, people of faith and goodwill, speak out, rise up, and say this is what needs to happen.